I want to introduce Sandy Lackey, who is Senior Worldwide Sales Manager of Leisure Travel for Best Western Hotel Group. And she's also served as the chair of our technology task force over the last year and has been instrumental in leading this group to putting these sessions like this together today. And you've got a great one for us today. So Sandy, without any further ado, take over.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you could join us today for the second in our three-part series on technology and travel distribution in the inbound travel industry. The first was a perspective on our hybrid travel distribution, which was held a couple weeks ago with a panel of inbound operators and hoteliers discussing hybrid models of distribution and why they're important for building international business. You can find this recording of that session on our website at www.inboundtravel.org/webinars. So today's session is going to be about retooling the travel business for the future. It will provide an update on what's happening in the travel technology and the importance of open standard for a seamless travel experience. The speakers will also discuss integration of new health data and the post-pandemic travel system. On the third session, which will take place on July 6th, will feature a demo of OpenTravel's 2.0 open source standards by LinkRez with Brian Bell, President and CEO of LinkRez Travel, and Jeff ErnstFriedman, Executive Director of OpenTravel Alliance, who also is our monitor today. Now allow me to introduce today's esteemed speakers. This trio has provided us with quarterly updates on what's happening in travel technology, open standards, integration of health data, and post-pandemic business shifts. Moderating the panel is Jeff ErnstFriedman, Managing Director of OpenTravel Alliance. IATA has partnered with OpenTravel to develop connectivity standards for our tour operators. And on our panel will be Greg Land, who is the Senior Vice President of Travel and Transport for IBM. And we also have Stu Waldron, who is the Chief of Technical Advisor for OpenTravel Alliance. Welcome to all our panelists today. Jeff, take it away.
Thank you, Sandy, for that intro. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this group again as the second part of our series. We spoke earlier this year. I think the vaccines had just been approved and started to be rolled out, and here we are about 6 months later, and I believe 45% of the US population has at least one dose out, and that number is growing. And I think California, which was my area in the Bay Area, was one of the first to shut down. We reopened just last week, and the change is pretty immediate. We've already seen returns to some with live shows, amusement parks, and other things. Although places like Disneyland are still limited to California residents, but we're still seeing a dramatic change, and that's exciting to be a part of. And I think, Sandy, your experience, nothing kind of represents the U-shaped curve with this pandemic as you as with your role with Best Western and in between here. So we're excited that you're leading this, continuing to lead this group. So with me today, as I spoke, we have Greg Land, who's on a board of OpenTravel as well as WTTC, and he's going to provide the larger scope view of this pandemic, what it looks like internationally, what we can expect to see returns to travel from a larger perspective, both coming inbound to the United States and broadly. And Stu Waldron will help us talk about the technology changes that are going to help redefine what the future of what this looks like. In my talks with Lisa Simon before this call about what we were going to talk about, it was this expectation of, now that everyone's experienced this from a company perspective in travel, how things are so broad, how can companies allow themselves to be resilient for whatever change may happen? variants to the coronavirus are already pretty prevalent in the UK, the United States. So we're not quite out of the woods yet. So I'm hoping to keep my negative comments about what happened, kind of keep the comments about pilot shortages and variants to a minimum, and instead we'll just focus on the future. So with that, I wanted to tip off to Greg to talk about just a quick step back to refresh some of the newer people who are on a previous call about what is the larger landscape, and then if you can provide some insights about what's happening going forward. So we can talk about from your perch with IBM and the data and your various partners, what it looks like, the landscape today, and what we can expect to see going forward. So
Sure,
take it away.
sure. No, thanks, Jeff, and hello, everyone. And I'll throw out kind of what I see as kind of where the tipping point started for things coming back, especially for inbound travel to the US. We did a traveler survey around the end of March to look at consumer sentiment, both in the retail space and the travel space, pre and post vaccine. It was kind of at the point where we were starting to see, more and more people get vaccinated, not only in the US, but in other markets around the world. It was before we started seeing these other variants pop up. But what this survey came back with is that once people are vaccinated, they are much more comfortable getting out and shopping in the retail world, and they're definitely more comfortable getting out and traveling in the travel world. And we looked at both leisure travel and business travel. We looked at we talked to 15,000 travelers across 9 different countries. So this did include a large population of travelers outside the US looking to travel. And it was a big jump. It was about a 20% point jump from people that were comfortable to travel before they were vaccinated and after they were vaccinated. And I'm sure if we took that survey again now, with what we've seen here in the US, with the vaccination rates continuing and states reopening, I think we'd see the numbers be even higher now. It just goes to the point that we are going to see consumer trends change quickly. We are going to see the trends evolve quickly as well. So the other advice that we've been giving to our clients is take any of the data modeling you've done for revenue management or marketing or sales targets or what your feeder cities are before the pandemic and hit a reset button, because the consumer behavior has changed drastically. How they shop for travel, what they buy, and most importantly, what they're willing to pay a premium for has changed drastically. So we're doing a lot of work helping everybody across travel kind of rethink their data models, but also look at how they can monitor the trends very quickly, because you can't wait 6 months to identify a trend, because the trend's going to change about every 2 weeks for the next year as we see customer sentiment and customer behavior change. So all that being said, we're kind of at a point now where it's kind of finally tipped back to public policy and governments. We've all seen the news here in the US, state by state, where some states are now offering readily accessible vaccine passports, like what Jeff talked about in California. We launched that with the state of New York back in late February, early March. But then you have other states that are saying, no, we're not going to do vaccine passports. We're not going to require companies to check for vaccine passports. It's going to be on the honor system. So both in the US and Canada, at the state and province level, we're seeing a very segmented and divided approach to this. But I think when you look outside the US, what we're seeing more consistently is a national approach where countrywide, they're setting up vaccine registration platforms. They're setting up both web portals and mobile apps where anybody coming into their markets are going to have to register. They're going to have to show their proof of vaccine in advance. And then they may or may not also have to take a test upon arrival. So every country is kind of rolling out something differently. I know you guys mostly work with inbound travelers. So folks coming into the US, the only requirement right now from the CDC is that you show a proof of a negative test result that was taken 72 hours or less from the time of departure. Once you get into the US, everybody is free to move about between states without showing additional proof of vaccination or showing additional proof of a negative test. So for the inbound travelers you guys deal with, it's not going to be an issue. But for them leaving to go back home, you may have to think about coordinating more at that global level and really understanding what's happening outside the US. So just really briefly, two important milestones that we're about to cross right now. You've seen all these different platforms and technologies around vaccine passports and test credentials and things like that, normally in the form of a QR code that gets scanned at boarding or at check-in for your flights, and maybe by other travel providers that are part of your journey. Going forward, what's going to happen is all of that's going to be put into these platforms that are being set up by each individual country. So just be aware of that. Now, in the past, you've had to have issuers that were part of that technology platform. What's going to change over the next 30 days is there's a new format out there called VCI Smart Health Cards, which is a vaccine standard for these QR codes. And then by the end of July, you're going to see all 27 of the EU countries finally put procedures in place to adopt a single standard for their EU, what they're calling green certificates, which are the health credential that's required to enter the EU countries. So here by the end of July, the verifier applications that are being used to verify these QR codes, in most cases are going to be able to verify any of these QR codes that either meet a VCI standard, or you're going to hear it for the EU, they're going to call a DCC standard, a digital credential or certificate. So you're going to hear that talked about a lot here, but basically it's going to really kind of narrow the options, and everybody's going to have to adopt these standards for these health credentials. But you don't need to worry about it for the inbound. You may need to educate yourself a little bit on the outbound flights as you're getting people back to their home country.
And for my experience with that, trying to sign up for the California one, which we're doing a QR code, I went in, I was able to get mine early on by volunteering at a location. So I didn't provide my phone number or email address. So I wasn't able to get my QR code. So I have to fill out this form and get back to you. So to kind of dovetail with what Greg is saying is that it's important to kind of get on people to make sure that they have it, because you're, I know with my parents who are big into cruises, they've booked their third and they're looking for their fourth cruise already starting in November. The QR codes are going to be, the vaccine requirements going to be a big deal for them, and they're leaving from 3 different states. So there'll be 3 different requirements. So they're not going to want to worry about that at port, that, you know, whether they can connect or not. So I think it's
one last point I'll make on that.
Mm-hmm.
A completely non-technology related point. It's all about setting the right expectation up front for your traveler. And, you know, you'll start seeing a lot of travel websites, a lot of airline websites. They're creating these sections on their websites called travel ready information, and by destination, they're putting information out there where you can go and educate yourself as the traveler on exactly what you need to get. Because a lot of the burden does go back on the traveler, that they're getting their test from an approved place, that they're getting their credential within that window of time that they need for boarding their flight. So I think one of the other things that you guys need to think about too is, how are you communicating expectations to the traveler in advance? How far in advance are you communicating that? And how are you helping facilitate them making sure that they have all the information in their hands well before they need to start scheduling a test or worrying about, you know, how, you know, what form their vaccine credential is in. So upfront communication and over communicate to your traveler is some of the best advice I can give at this point.
One of the things that you talked about in the last call, Greg, was the kind of this radius when people were searching for travel, was this 500-mile roughly driving radius. And I'm going to put you on the spot to see, now that you talked about that 20% of people are comfortable, are you seeing that expand where people are looking more towards flights, or can you speak to kind of how those changes were made? Because you kind of talk about how quickly it collapsed and then coming back again, so you can kind of give people an example of that 2-week changing in trends that you spoke about earlier.
Yeah, I think pre-vaccine, we saw people still a little hesitant to get on airplanes. And that's where we saw most of the leisure travel that had come back prior to vaccination was in that 5-hour drive radius. So we were seeing a lot of road trips last summer, even into the fall and the holidays, we still saw a lot of road traffic. I think even up through spring break and Easter, we were still seeing barely 1 million people a day that were back at the TSA checkpoints nationwide. Here this past month, we're now seeing it sustainable at over 2 million a day. So I think people have gotten over the fear of getting on an airplane, especially if they're vaccinated. So we very quickly have seen, as the vaccination numbers improve across the US, we very quickly have seen people willing to get back on airplanes. We've seen airfares starting to go back up because of that. But as you've also seen this past weekend with all the cancellations, there's still a couple of hurdles there. The airlines are struggling to get furloughed employees back to work fast enough. So there are staffing issues that are causing some cancellations. But the other thing that is also causing cancellations, I just got off the phone with an airline client who canceled 400 flights this past month, not because of staffing, but because people arrived at the gate. They didn't have proper documentation of their test or vaccine status to get access to where they were flying. They were denied boarding, but then they checked the bag, so the airline had to go pull their bags off the aircraft, and that caused them to take a delay on the departure. So there are still some hurdles with vaccine and test credentials if you're flying international. These were international flights. But I think the thing you're talking about, Jeff, with the drive market versus the fly market, we're seeing that shift very, very quickly once people are vaccinated.
Thank you. So I want to tip over to Stu here to talk about the kind of the behind the scenes with the data component. First, before I stop, Greg, is there anything else you want to touch on that topic before I go?
Go ahead.
So Stu, wanted to talk about some of the more recent work that we've done with OpenTravel and the fly and rail components and those conversations, and kind of what you're allowed to talk about, because I know those are early conversations. I think with this audience, it's the inbound, their experience, will be, that will be a relevant part of the trip, at least on the arrival, and then the second leg of the departure side. And to talk about kind of broadly the connectivity and how data can help adapt to the quick trends, and connectivity will help people adapt in this world where things are kind of up in the air still.
Okay, and I assume you're asking Greg if he had anything else, because it's hard to get me to shut up once you let me.
Yeah, we only have a half hour.
So what we're still seeing is still a lot of vestiges about the difficulty and expense of travel partners talking to each other. Last time, and we still tend to talk about it as API chaos. So starting off with what you said, Jeff, about rail connecting to air, this is mostly an initiative in Europe, still at the point where the European Commission long ago had mandated to make it easier for travelers to, as they call it in Europe, intermodal travel, to switch between air and rail more seamlessly in their journey for their trip planning and everything else. It's been frustratingly slow in Europe, meeting what the European Commission has mandated. And so there is more activity today than we've seen in a while, where air and rail are talking to each other, and the big rail operators in Europe, like Deutsche Bundesbahn and SNCF and Trenitalia and others, are stepping up their efforts to be able to talk and create travel partners to create more of this seamless travel journey, as they call it. And that is also backed into what Greg has been talking about safety and security as part of that seamless travel journey. So the barrier still tends to be in doing that is that everybody has their own version of their APIs and process. So even between the rail operators, there's quite a lot of differences in what the booking process and ticketing process and payment process is. And of course, there's quite a lot of differences between air carriers. We have the IATA group of air carriers that tend to follow the legacy IATA protocols. And then we have what we've all collectively called, low-cost airlines, which aren't necessarily that true anymore, but a whole group, and the fastest growing group of air capacity, and those that do not follow the old IATA capabilities and process. And so this barrier of communicating with each other is getting a lot more serious attention. So part of it is driven by the safety and security initiatives that Greg has been leading about how to communicate this vital information that has to be done in a secure way. But part of it is also driven by the cost of this interconnectivity, especially multimodal, especially working with hoteliers and others. I'd say collectively the industry has had just about enough of that, all they can stand of it. Connectivity costs have not gone down, they continue to go up. So as we add more complexity into the reservation process, now again with verifying, for example, vaccination status, it's just making it worse and worse. And so particularly for tour operators, they get their products exposed, to go beyond their personal websites, the costs are collectively prohibitive. So that's what we're hearing a lot at OpenTravel, and looking at various ways of connecting, not only looking at the interconnection issues, but actually working across standards bodies, making more and more efforts to say, well, the standards bodies themselves are not exactly cooperating with each other to the level that will help address this problem. So OpenTravel is working with what's known as the Open API initiative, working on ways to create more of an association, we'll use that term at the moment, between the various trade organizations and standards bodies to say, well, we have a primary goal here, and that primary goal is service to the customer, service to the traveler, take the friction out of travel. And what comes right behind that is, as we take the friction out of travel, we'll also take some of the cost, some of this connectivity cost that is making it so prohibitively expensive for a lot of people to get their products to market in the digital travel retail market, and again, meet that primary goal of service to the customer. So there's a lot of interesting discussions going on. We're looking at, not only data differences between hospitality and rail and air, that some would like to refer to you as a traveler, some refer to you as a passenger, some refer to you as the guest, but it's all the same person. We can solve those data problems, but in order to really attack the costs and the usability, we have to look at what we'll collectively call API behaviors. What do the APIs actually do? What are the process flows? What are the other things we need to do? So whether you're a distribution channel, an online travel agency, a consolidator that's pulling, trip level or activity-based travel together, to go ahead and make it easier and more predictable when I connect to any supplier of travel products and services, there's more of a recognizable pattern that you can code to, that you can react to, and not everything is a one-off. So in a nutshell, that's what's driving us, and it's kind of goes hand in hand with the safe and secure travel, because again, that's adding a level of complexity to what was already a very complex market. And that complexity is just driving costs through the roofs.
I think to talk about IITA's involvement in the technology task force that Sandy is leading, and there's quite a few on that group on this call, being a part of those conversations and inviting OpenTravel to be a part of it allows the voice of the tour operator to be directly engaged in these conversations. So we have a pipeline of use cases so that the solutions are not just what's best for the technology providers, but it's also the end users, and we can be a part of those conversations. So that's why support of this group and then and these calls help us get that information to them so that it's useful and it doesn't essentially swap one cost out for another. Greg, if I go back to you about from a broader perspective, with the travel components and the kind of the STJ thing that Stu was talking about, the seamless traveler journey, and just kind of that experience. Is there any conversation about that now that there's these passports, the health components? Is there an expectation of another layer to that, or can you kind of provide an update of what kind of the progress of that is to date, and
Sure.
that how we can kind of see that today?
Yeah, so what Jeff is referencing, even before the pandemic, we had this global initiative called Seamless Traveler Journey that was working to put global standards in place for digital travel credentials and biometrics. So we had a lot of travel providers that were starting to test out using digital forms of ID to track the passenger through the process, but then start attaching that to a biometric ID to then be able to streamline checkpoints like security and boarding and things like that. So there was quite a good bit of good progress there. We had 5 different airports and 1 cruise port actually testing pilots before the pandemic. But there were still a lot of people across the travel supply chain or the journey that I think struggled to see how they justify the investment. I think as we've worked through this past year and they now see that the benefit of having the digital health credential and how that streamlines a lot of these processes for checking the health credential, I think everybody's seeing that as an entry point to this broader infrastructure that needs to be in place around digital travel credentials and ultimately biometrics. A lot of what we're seeing right now, and this is going to be true for inbound travelers that you guys work with especially, for inbound travel to the US, and the CDC still going to require, probably for quite some time, the negative test requirement. If you've got people coming from 20 different countries, you're probably going to see 20 different formats on paper for that test result. So if there is no standard and there's no way to manage that digitally, that's going to be the problem. And so it really has opened everybody's mind to, this is about creating long-term infrastructure for the industry. This is about creating resilience for the industry. And more, it's opening everybody's mind to, we've got to invest now and use these platforms that we're putting in place to verify digital health credentials and start looking at how those expand to be platforms to support long-term digital credentials of all kind, digital travel ID. Already in the state of New York and California, they're seeing these platforms as a way to now start migrating to digital driver's license. We know the TSA is already looking at on the iPhone with the new digital ID capabilities on the iPhone. They're looking at a mobile credential that could be used for your checkpoints at the TSA, where you literally just scan your driver's license with an iPhone and it creates a digital credential that can be scanned when you go through the TSA boarding checkpoint or security checkpoint. I know Louisiana has already started moving to digital driver's license. So we're already seeing this at a state level. We're seeing it even more broadly with other countries. We just launched a platform 2 weeks ago for a digital credential, a digital ID credential for the entire country of Germany. And they're starting to put in place for their residents a digital ID platform. We're seeing that in Denmark and some of the other Scandinavian countries as well. I know Canada is considering that also. So I think we're going to see this be the entry point to kind of get back on track with where we were about thinking about digital credentials. I think an interesting case study to look at, and I may have referenced this on the last call, and we walked through this case study in the global guidelines report that we published in December as part of the World Travel and Tourism Council global guidelines report that was issued on their website. Aruba launched a program a year ago to start testing digital IDs for travelers, and it's called Happy Aruba. And basically you go to their website or through a mobile app, you register your arrival into Aruba, it assigns you a digital ID, and that digital ID basically follows you throughout your entire journey on Aruba. It's used for your check-in to your hotel, it's used for your check-in for all your excursions and any other activities that you do while you're on the island. And you know, they already had that in place, so it somewhat facilitates contact tracing as well now when they do have somebody test positive once they're on the island of Aruba. But it's kind of that type of process flow for an inbound tourism application that I could see applying to this group and how you would apply that type of technology. We're already seeing other Caribbean islands like Grenada and others consider similar applications, and they're looking at adopting a standard for this type of application across all the Caribbean islands, because typically somebody comes to the Caribbean and they island hop. So to have one credential and to be able to share traveler information island to island, it's first about just creating a more seamless process, but longer term, it's about then taking that information and being able to push more personalized options to the traveler through those mobile apps and those portals, and maybe even fine tune what they plan for in their trip based on that information. So I think, unfortunately, it took a pandemic to get us to seriously start investing in this area of digital credentials. But I think everybody's starting to realize the traveler benefits of it, as well as the information it can provide to the travel provider to maybe anticipate some of the needs of the traveler and maybe even make it a more personalized experience.
Yeah, I would say for me, I'm in the second week of summer camps for my kids. So now, with including school, which reopened at the tail end, there's 3 different ways that we've checked in kids. Some of them you do it beforehand, some you have to do it on, and it creates these long lines that you get there. So before I didn't care about these things, but now I experience kind of the lag with it. You come to expect it, and then when you fill out all the data on an app, and you show them a QR code and they scan it, and your kid goes in and it flags, the other notification that the kid has been signed in or signed out, your expectations change, and then it becomes easier to expect that when you check into a hotel and other aspects. So I think what will, like you say, it took the pandemic to introduce these things, but as people start to experiencing them more, those who may have been like myself were just kind of, not into one extra app, enjoying the ease of doing this stuff. And you just get the email, kind of what you're saying early on, get the email beforehand and say, got to fill all this stuff out, because if you don't, you're going to be waiting in a long line. You experience it once, you're like, okay, I can do it. So I think we're seeing that when we talk about how trends change pretty quickly. Once people see one really long line and a short line, they go like, how do I get into that short line? And it could be filling out the app experience. So I think it'd be interesting to see how quickly people come to adopt these digital IDs that, at least in the US, been pretty reticent to pick up on. So Stu, from the technical side, can you kind of talk about, with the connections between those different components, and how it doesn't necessarily mean that a single company has to adopt a brand new thing each time. There's the technology, if there's a common standard amongst those, how easy it is to adopt, and like kind of lowering those costs. Because I can see some people say every time you add a new technology or a new requirement, that's a new cost for me. So can we talk about maybe the ways in which the standards process and support of those standards broadly can help keep those costs down to an extent, or what that means for the individual user?
Sure. Cost is a major driver of what we're looking at, because again, there's a lot of things, a lot of innovation tour operators and others would be doing and exposing their product, but costs become prohibitive. Sharing this information, everybody can immediately see the benefit, but the cost of sharing it and processing it is prohibitive. What Greg gave an example that some of the airlines are facing right now is, without a workable messaging format and process and standards, it's replaced by manual labor to figure out if everybody has the credentials they're supposed to have. And again, the costs are prohibitive, and it just doesn't scale. So a lot of times we will look at this as a cost problem, looking at as if we can get the cost of connecting and sharing information down in a safe and secure way, we do open up the market and let the really creative people decide what to do with that as we remove some of these cost barriers. The way you asked the question, Jeff, was also interesting, because in the past, the mentality has been to do things in a common way. We all had to go to a single source. many of you are, of course, familiar with the term PNR. You know, a lot of our world is still driven by old legacy PNR formats. And all through my 40 plus years of doing this, there's been multiple times we talking about, well, how do we get a centralized PNR so everybody sees the same view of the reservation? And this kind of, again, Jeff, the way you asked the question, this kind of ticked in my mind to also mention is like, we're not thinking that way anymore. So we're also talking about getting the costs down. What's very different about the technology of today is everything's distributed. Everything's cloud-based. So as we look through this, we'll look at, and this goes into the identity and secure wallet type discussions that Greg was leading to, that what you'll soon see, and I expect within 5 years, we'll see how that drives this, you will have the apps on your phone where you already have a wallet concept today. And in that wallet concept, not only will it hold, you know, what you have authorized people to know about you, it will also hold, just like your credit cards and everything else, it will actually only be the only global view of the reservation. What I mean global as your entire trip is in that wallet, but that is the only place it actually exists in total. All the various suppliers, even tour operators, have the information they need, but this is a very different distributed concept coming to the industry to meet GDPR and safety and security and other things that say we have to look at the technology quite differently than we looked at the past, with massive monolithic systems where everybody has to talk to a particular system or ultimately a particular database to talk to. A lot of the talk in the industry is saying to look at this entirely differently, that, quote, it's in the cloud, the data and the details of your journey and your trip are in the cloud, but to also meet the security needs is you are totally in control of that. And the only people that are going to see that detail is the people you have authorized to see that detail. And again, California privacy rules, GDPR and others are certainly also leading us into that direction. So I'm thinking that addresses what you said, Jeff, is that what goes hand in hand is by using the more modern distributed technologies and what's available to do in the cloud, which can handle massive amounts of data rather economically, we can approach the whole journey management problem differently than we had in the past with PNR type thinking. And that will open up that people can sell or retail based on destination-based travel, on activity-based travel. What is the tour experience I want to have? And when that data becomes more accessible in the cloud, then machine learning, artificial intelligence like technologies can be brought to bear to do the journey management problem for you. But again, we're looking at it in a safe and secure way to meet all the security expectations of that data, and that capability is totally in the hands of the traveler. But part of getting these cost of the acquisition of data down is what's going to open the market for entrepreneurs and startups to bring more AI, ML type technologies to bear on the travel management problem. The vast majority of travel today is in fact unmanaged. And so again, somebody just wants to know how to experience a tour experience. You don't want to have to go in the nitty gritty of how I cobble together all the piece parts manually. So there's a lot of interesting things going on in the technology area where we pretty much know how machine learning and artificial intelligence can solve these problems. It's a data and cost problem at this point. It's just too damn expensive to get to the data and the travel products and services needed. So again, that brings us back around to how we're addressing it. But Jeff, you kind of, again, touched on the issue that what is that going to mean to the traveler? And the means the traveler is going to be in control of their data and not so much monolithic thinking that there's a PNR off someplace that everybody has to coordinate access to. So the IT is going to change quite a lot too.
So I wanted to, Sandy had opened up a chat for any questions or comments. So I definitely want to hear from anyone here who's any company who's kind of adopted a different digital posture that they did pre-pandemic or stuff that they're looking to do or some of the challenges they face. But while people kind of think about that, Greg, I wanted to go back to you just kind of as we move towards a wrap up of just kind of what we think of the projections with travel, the short term, and is the idea that we're going to return to how things were a couple years ago on an unbroken path and some kind of Marvel Cinematic Universe kind of time split, or are things just going to be scrambled and it's up to companies kind of to adjust to what things are going to happen, and companies that may have been on a similar trajectory may not be anymore, and they're just going to different approach, or what do you think kind of going forward with that?
Well, I want to make one comment on the last thing that Stu said. And one of the important things to remember as both a travel provider and a travel service provider, as well as a passenger, is an important thing to look at is decentralized digital ID. That's important. And that goes back to the point that Stu just made of, as these digital credentials roll out, that means the user or the holder, or in our case, the passenger, is the one who has complete control over their information. It's not stored with anybody else. They may be able to verify it, but it's not stored with anybody else. So when you think about these digital travel IDs, they're going to be managed with one type of technology to be able to be kept very secure, very private, and the traveler to have complete control over it. When we think about some of the data attributes that are saved and utilized for things like personalization, that's different. And either way, the traveler is going to have to give consent for you to do anything with that information. So the nice thing is a lot of what we're dealing with right now is getting all of that infrastructure in place. It's educating and driving awareness on both travelers and travel providers on a lot of this stuff and how it needs to be set up and structured and managed from a technology perspective. To your question, Jeff, we still think leisure travel is coming back the fastest. We're going to see that this summer. We're seeing things ramp up very, very quickly. When you compare that to business travel, all of our surveys with travelers, it looks like business travel, people are going to get more comfortable with going into the fall. We're now seeing, as states lift requirements and as more people are vaccinated here in the US, we're seeing offices reopen. IBM just announced all of their US offices reopening on September 7th. We're seeing more and more of our clients reopen offices, and more of my teams are back in the office with their clients already this month. So I think the real tipping point is the vaccination. As long as we stay on track with vaccinations in this country, I think we're going to see more and more things open. The thing that's going to be slowest to come back, I just participated on a panel last week looking specifically at group travel. I think that one is still going to be a little bit slower to come back, especially groups that are facilitated around corporate events and things like that. We're starting to see weddings come back this month. I should say weddings getting rescheduled this month that were supposed to happen last year. So we're starting to see family events and family groups and things like that come back. I think it's the big corporate events like incentive trips and corporate meetings and things like that. We may see a little of that come back fourth quarter of this year if we stay on track with vaccinations and we don't see the variants go too crazy here in the US. So I'm hoping that means, we start seeing inbound international travel start to pick up as well. Load factors in and out of the US for international travel are still pretty low, but I'm hoping towards the end of this year, maybe towards the holidays, 2021 at the end of the year, we'll start seeing some of that inbound international traffic pick up.
Just a quick question to you, Greg, on that. Budgets, corporate budgets. Most would not have budgeted anything this year for those events.
No.
And part of this is having the convincing way forward. So we're getting into crazy season, budget season in corporations now. I think the watch thing will say, do they actually start budgeting for corporate travel and events and conferences for next year? I think that's going to be the big telling factor.
Well, I think the interesting thing on that, Stu, is, Global Business Travel Association is planning on having their live event in Orlando in November. The World Aviation Festival, which is typically in September, was pushed out to December in London. Those are the first two conferences that I'm scheduled to be at live and in person. Everything prior to that is still all being done virtually. So I think you're going to see some test cases in late 2021. But to your point about planning and budgeting, I think most companies and most industry associations have not planned for anything in person this year, and they're hoping to come back with a vengeance in 2022.
Stu, do you have any quick parting shots on kind of the future of maybe some key technology points that people should look out for if they start kind of paying attention to now? They can kind of gear up as they get more integrated or something, you know, like with connectivity or other things that they, you know, really should continue to focus on going forward as we begin to reopen.
I'll make a request of this particular audience, how with, you know, Lisa's or Sandy's our help, but how do we get an idea of what the price points have to be? And that would take a little bit of explaining, but with the tour operators and other things that you are presumably working with, what is the what is the acceptable price point to get, quote, published online? And I mean published in the cloud, in the web, however you want to look at it, in a way where anybody can pick up the content and open up the retailing channel. So one of my requests would be to sit down and understand a little bit better the economics of the tour operators and say, where is the price sensitivity? What do we have to get to say, if I can get you published online in an easily consumable format for your product and services, what is the price point that's acceptable, even as just as a starting point? That's one of the things as we plan and looking at standards and work with, you know, vendors like IBM and others. There are ways we can pull together kits, you know, work kits, or, you know, your distribution in a box type conversations. There's actually a lot of things we can do to lower the costs, but we need a little more real world discussion on, so where is that price point? I don't care if it's possible to get to or not at the moment. It's just, where should the target price point be? Because what's happening right now is we have a good collection of standards bodies, trade associations, and technology vendors all looking at this problem, that we have a cost barrier in the travel market. And how do we knock down those cost barriers? Well, a little more real world information on, well, so what should the target be? What is realistic? What would be a winner for the majority of the tour operators out there to get wider distribution and availability of their products? So it's a selfish request for help.
Yeah. So good dovetail to our next part in this series is a demo, and where we talk about integrating of the standards LinksRes has done, and integrating the different distribution channels into a single portal, and kind of the role OpenTravel plays in making that happen, and you know what that is related to costs. So I think that's a good segue here. So Sandy, I want to tip to you as we're leading out the end here. I don't know if there's any questions or comments we can do, or yeah, send us home.
Yeah. Hey, great job by all. We have a few questions. I see one here from Gloria, and she states, regarding the PCR test for international group that is departing back home, is there any particular guideline of the laboratory listing that are being approved and accepted by international airlines?
Yeah, and it's kind of at the country level, which makes it really complex right now. I just had a friend who was trying to fly to Dubai, and the UAE specifies certain labs you have to go to. Certain countries haven't approved certain vaccines. So I understand that even some countries, with the problems they had with AstraZeneca, some countries have dropped AstraZeneca off their approved list for vaccines as well. So I think the best thing that you can advise is that they not only check with the airline website, but they also look at the U.S. Consulate Office website, and they will tell you country by country what is required. And if they do require a specific lab vendor, that it'll be referenced there as well. So I would say check both the US consulate website as well as the airline website and see what they recommend. Most of the airlines are referring you to certain test partners for your test result. And you want to make sure you abide by that, because in most cases, it's because they can or cannot read the QR code that's issued by a particular test partner. And then some of the destinations are requiring certain test partners as well, because they've gone through their own process of vetting those labs and making sure they meet their standards. Don't let your traveler go to a pop-up at a gas station on the corner. I literally drove past a pop-up COVID test tent at a gas station here on a corner in Fort Lauderdale. I wouldn't recommend that, because that may be a little bit fishy. For our network, for our digital health pass, we actually have a process where we vet the test partners and their labs to make sure they meet FDA standards. And we only onboard somebody as a viable test partner if they meet all the requirements. So you do have to be careful about where you're referring your travelers to. But for outbound travelers, I would say definitely look at the website for the airline and the US consulate.
Great information. You gave us a lot to think about.
A little color to it there, but yeah.
Yes. One of the other questions we had, you were discussing about some of the other countries that are coming together with some standards, but do you think all of the countries will come together in one standard, or will it take time?
Your last comment there is probably the best thing to think. Is I'm hoping we'll get there. It's going to take time, because even with the EU Parliament laid out standards. The EU Parliament dictated when all these standards need to be put in place, but they stopped short of requiring all 27 EU countries use one common platform. So now we see each of the countries setting up their own platforms, their own portals, their own mobile apps. So for example, with Spain, June 7th, Spain launched an SPTH website and mobile app, and every inbound traveler has to go set up a profile, register, and upload their credential, because they want everybody on one common mobile app to make it easier to verify your health credential as you move about, once you arrive, and as well as you move about Spain. Most of the countries are doing something like that. Now, a lot of countries are still concerned about contact tracing, as they have new variants pop up and people test positive maybe once they've arrived in the country. So some of them are doing this with the objective of also using these apps for contact tracing as well once you're inside the country. So there are several countries that are requiring it from that angle as well. I think as we get these EU standards issued and put in place over the next 30 days, I think as the VCI smart health card standards become more prevalent around the world, I'm hoping everybody gradually clusters around those two standards, and it'll make it a little bit easier and a little bit more straightforward, so that it doesn't matter what state or province I live in, my vaccine credential can be read and verified by anybody, and it doesn't matter where I get my test result from, it can be verified and read by anyone. So I think we'll see things starting to cluster around those two basic standards, EU and VCI, and let's hope that we can at least get to that point on a worldwide basis. Now, China has set up something completely different, and like a lot of other systems and platforms, I think they're going to stay somewhat proprietary for just their citizens that will require people going to China. But I think everybody else will start kind of clustering around these other two that I've spoken about.
And what I would quickly add is that we're okay with, let's call it manageable chaos.
Yeah.
If we end up with a half a dozen on any of these things, the privacy, the identity, if we end up with a half a dozen or less groupings like that, okay, we can handle that.
Yeah.
You know, it's just, let's not have 10, 20, 30, 100. That's unmanageable.
Yeah, exactly.
That's right. Stop the spread of standards to 6. I think is what we can settle on.
One of the things that Gloria had made a statement that she wanted to share, and she was just saying that we do not see that there is any standard for digital IDs yet, especially in Asian countries. She says the markets that her company is dealing with, which is interesting. Is there any more questions anybody might have? Well, I don't see any more in the chat session for us, but if you guys do have questions you think of later on, please reach out to the IITA Technology Department as well as, Jeff, and we can, help you through and answering your questions that you might have. But we want to thank everybody today for their time, and especially this awesome panel that we had. And Jeff, we always look forward, and Greg and Stu, to your updates on a quarterly basis. And thank you so much.
Sure.
Have a
Thank
great
you all.
day, everybody.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for sticking through the call. Appreciate it.